In the early morning light of his final years, Ronald Reagan sat in a quiet house far removed from the world he once commanded, curtains half drawn, a chair by the window, familiar rooms that no longer carried familiar meanings. Each day followed a careful routine, guided by others, shaped by notes and reminders, meant to hold together what memory could not. Few people beyond those walls remembered that this silence belonged to a man who once spoke to a nation, whose voice defined an era and whose presence reshaped history. The applause never truly stopped, but it no longer reached Ronald Reagan himself, and it leaves a question that lingers long after the noise fades. When memory disappears, what remains of a life, and who remains beside it? Ronald Wilson Reagan was born in February of 1911 in the small town of Tampico, Illinois. It was not a place shaped by ambition or grandeur, but by routine, restraint, and survival. His father, Jack Reagan, was a traveling shoe salesman, charming, talkative, and unpredictable. His mother, Nell Wilson Reagan, was deeply religious, disciplined, and morally unwavering. Between them existed a quiet tension that would shape their younger son more than either parent may have realized. Jack Reagan struggled with alcoholism for much of Ronald's childhood. Some days he was warm and engaging, on others absent in all but body. The instability created an atmosphere where young Ronald learned early how to observe, adapt, and retreat inward. Nell, by contrast, offered structure and certainty. She believed fiercely in goodness, redemption, and the power of words. She read aloud to her sons, recited poetry, and filled their home with stories where character mattered more than circumstance. This contrast between chaos and control left a deep imprint. From his father came a lesson in charm and storytelling. From his mother, a belief in moral clarity and performance with purpose. Ronald learned to speak clearly, to project calm, even when uncertainty lingered beneath the surface. Silence, he discovered, could be unsettling. A confident voice, however, could steady a room. As a child, Reagan was not considered exceptional. He was average in school, small in stature, and often overlooked. Yet he excelled in roles that required presence rather than dominance. As a lifeguard during his teenage years, he was known for vigilance and repetition, watching, waiting, acting only when necessary. The job demanded memory, attention, and calm under pressure. Years later, those same traits would define his public image. Family life offered little sense of permanence. The Reagans moved frequently, following Jack's work, reinforcing a subtle understanding that nothing stayed fixed for long. Friends came and went, places blurred together. What endured was the need to adapt, to step into new rooms and quickly learn how to belong. Reagan's relationship with his parents was respectful but distant. Emotion was rarely discussed. Vulnerability was not modeled. Problems were endured quietly rather than confronted directly. In this environment, young Ronald learned a critical survival skill: how to separate inner life from outward expression. What he felt did not always need to be shown. What he showed did not always need to be felt. This separation would later become a strength and, eventually, a fault line. His mother's faith instilled in him the idea that life followed a narrative arc. Trials led to purpose, suffering led to meaning. It was a comforting framework, one that suggested order even when reality felt disjointed. Yet embedded within it was an unspoken assumption that memory, identity, and selfhood were stable, that a person could carry their story intact from beginning to end. No one in the Reagan household imagined a future where that story could fragment. The family did not speak of illness beyond what could be managed. Mental decline was not a topic of discussion. Aging was something that happened quietly, privately, and out of sight. Children grew, parents faded, and life moved forward without pause. For Ronald Reagan, childhood planted the seeds of a lifelong pursuit, to be seen as steady, articulate, and in control, to become someone whose voice mattered, to build an identity strong enough to outlast uncertainty. But it also planted a quieter question, one that would not surface until decades later. If a life is held together by stories, beliefs, and memory, what happens when memory itself begins to loosen? Ronald Reagan did not enter his profession with the confidence of someone who knew where he was going. He entered it the way many young men of his generation did, by following opportunity, curiosity, and the quiet hope that somewhere ahead lay a clearer version of himself. After graduating from Eureka College in the early 1930s, Reagan did not step onto a stage or into a spotlight. He began behind a microphone. Radio broadcasting offered him something familiar and safe: structure, repetition, and the power of voice without the burden of physical presence. As a sports announcer in Iowa, Reagan learned how to narrate moments he could not always see. He described baseball games from telegraph wires, reconstructing plays through imagination and rhythm. Accuracy mattered, but so did confidence. The audience needed to believe. This was his first professional lesson in performance. Conviction could fill gaps that reality left behind. When Reagan moved to Hollywood later in the decade, he arrived without the aura of inevitability that surrounded future stars. He was handsome but not striking, talented but not exceptional. His early film roles placed him squarely in the middle of the industry, reliable, agreeable, rarely commanding the frame. Yet Hollywood rewarded what Reagan offered consistently: professionalism, composure, and a voice that carried assurance. He was cast often as the decent man, the soldier, the athlete, the romantic lead whose strength lay in moral clarity rather than emotional complexity. These roles did not demand vulnerability. They required steadiness. Reagan delivered that with ease. Behind the scenes, the work was less glamorous: long hours, studio contracts that limited freedom, a constant awareness that success was conditional and temporary. Reagan observed how quickly careers could stall, how easily actors were replaced when novelty faded. The lesson was subtle but enduring. Relevance had to be maintained. During this period, Reagan also experienced early fractures in his personal life. His first marriage, entered while his career was still forming, ended in divorce. It was a quiet failure, handled without public bitterness, but it reinforced a pattern already familiar from childhood: emotional distance as a means of control. When life became complicated, Reagan moved forward rather than inward. As his acting career stabilized, Reagan became increasingly involved in industry politics, eventually serving as president of the Screen Actors Guild. This role marked a turning point. It required leadership without spectacle, negotiation without vulnerability. He spoke for others, mediated conflict, and learned to frame complex realities into clear narratives. Once again, his voice became his most valuable asset. More importantly, this phase introduced him to a larger stage, one where influence extended beyond scripts and studios. Reagan discovered that people listened when he spoke, not because he revealed himself, but because he reassured them. He did not unsettle audiences. he steadied them. Yet beneath this growing confidence lay an unexamined dependency. Reagan's sense of purpose was increasingly tied to external roles, to being heard, seen, and validated. The profession did not merely offer him work, it offered him identity. Few around him recognized this as a risk. Success disguised it as strength. As Reagan transitioned away from acting toward public life, the pattern remained consistent. He did not chase attention recklessly. He accepted it when it arrived. Each step forward felt earned, rational, and controlled. There was no sense of fragility, only progression. But embedded within this ascent was a quiet irony. The profession that taught Reagan how to perform certainty also taught him how easily identity could be shaped, adjusted, and replaced. He learned how to become a version of himself that others trusted. What he never had reason to consider, at least not yet, was what might happen if the ability to hold that version together began to slip. Because when a life is built around voice, memory, and narrative control, the loss of any one of those is not merely decline. It is disintegration, and it raises a question that would follow him long after the cameras stopped rolling. If identity is performed over a lifetime, who are we when we can no longer remember the script? By the time Ronald Reagan reached the height of his public life, he had spent decades perfecting a single skill: presence. He understood timing, tone, and the quiet authority of a steady voice. These were not accidental traits. They were the result of years spent in studios, meeting rooms, and public forums where confidence mattered more than confession. Reagan's ascent to national leadership did not feel abrupt. It unfolded gradually, step by step, each role preparing him for a larger audience. When he finally stood at the center of American public life, he appeared not as a man discovering power, but as someone long accustomed to being watched. He spoke in complete thoughts, delivered lines with clarity, and rarely revealed hesitation. For many, he embodied reassurance during a period marked by uncertainty. The years at the top were filled with ceremony, decision-making, and relentless visibility. Reagan's days followed precise schedules. Every appearance was planned. Every word was weighed. The machinery around him existed to preserve consistency, the same consistency he had learned to value since childhood. To the public, he seemed tireless, optimistic, and unwavering. Yet this period also demanded a level of endurance few could sustain indefinitely. Behind the scenes, the pace was exhausting. Travel, briefings, speeches, and negotiations left little room for reflection. Aging was managed quietly. Fatigue was explained away as routine. In a culture that prized strength, slowing down was not easily acknowledged. Reagan continued forward, supported by systems designed to maintain the image of continuity. Those closest to him noticed subtle changes over time. Moments of forgetfulness were not uncommon in high-pressure environments and were often dismissed as harmless. The demands of leadership offered countless explanations for lapses: stress, overwork, distraction. Nothing seemed out of place enough to warrant deeper concern. The paradox of Reagan's peak years was this: while his influence expanded outward, his personal world narrowed. Privacy became scarce. Genuine connection became filtered through protocol. Even family moments were framed by public expectation. The man known for warmth and humor was increasingly shielded by distance, not intentionally, but inevitably. Public admiration grew alongside this separation. Reagan became a symbol more than a person. His image circulated far beyond his physical presence, carried by recordings, photographs, and headlines. The voice mattered more than the man behind it. In this environment, identity was reinforced externally. Success was measured in reception rather than reflection. And for Reagan, whose sense of self had long been intertwined with performance, this reinforcement felt natural. But every performance has a cost. As the years progressed, Reagan's reliance on routine deepened. Schedules were not merely organizational tools, they were anchors. Notes, briefings, and repetition became essential. These details were invisible to the public, absorbed quietly into the structure of daily life. Nothing appeared broken. Nothing demanded intervention. And yet, with the benefit of distance, these years reveal something fragile beneath the triumph. A life built on memory, recall, and narrative control was unknowingly placing its greatest demands on the very faculties that would later prove most vulnerable. When Reagan left office, he did so with dignity and acclaim. The applause was sustained. The legacy seemed secure. There was no dramatic collapse, no public reckoning, just a transition, orderly, celebrated, and seemingly complete. But transitions, like endings, often reveal truths only in hindsight. The peak years gave Reagan everything he had sought: influence, admiration, and a permanent place in public memory. They also left him unprepared for a future in which memory itself would no longer be reliable. And so, as the spotlight gradually dimmed and the pace finally slowed, a different test began to take shape, one not measured by approval or achievement, but by endurance without recognition. It is one thing to leave power behind. It is another to discover that the self who once held it may not fully remain. And it leads naturally to a question that grows heavier with time. When a life reaches its highest point, does it prepare us for what comes after, or does it only delay the reckoning? When Ronald Reagan left public office, the transition appeared smooth, almost ceremonial. There was no abrupt fall, no scandal to explain a retreat. The world saw a former leader stepping gracefully into private life, his legacy already fixed in history. Appearances were selective, words were carefully chosen, the image remained intact. But beneath that calm surface, something far more difficult was beginning, slowly, quietly, and without drama. In the early years after public life, Reagan remained active. He traveled, delivered occasional speeches, and worked on memoirs that reflected on his years in the spotlight. To the outside world, this looked like a well-earned retirement. To those closest to him, it was a period of subtle adjustments. Conversations were sometimes repeated. Names occasionally escaped recall. Small lapses appeared and disappeared, easily explained away by age or fatigue. Nothing about these moments felt alarming on its own. In a life filled with intense responsibility, memory slips were expected. And because Reagan had always relied on preparation, routine, and support systems, those systems quietly expanded to compensate. What made this period uniquely fragile was its invisibility. There was no single moment of collapse, no public scene that demanded attention. The tragedy did not arrive loudly. It seeped in. As time passed, the adjustments became more deliberate. Schedules tightened. Environments were simplified. Familiar faces were prioritized. The world around Reagan narrowed, not by force, but by necessity. The structure that once enabled leadership now served a different purpose: preservation. Then came the decision that would redefine his remaining years. In the mid-1990s, Reagan and his family chose to publicly acknowledge that he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The announcement did not come through a press conference or a spokesperson. It came through a letter, measured, dignified, and unmistakably human. In it, Reagan acknowledged that he was beginning a journey that would take him away from the world he had long addressed. The choice to disclose was not required. Many in similar positions would have chosen silence. Privacy was an option. Yet Reagan's decision carried weight precisely because it resisted concealment. It framed illness not as weakness, but as reality. For the public, the letter was startling. For decades, Reagan had been defined by clarity, of speech, of purpose, of conviction. To imagine that clarity dissolving felt almost incompatible with the image they held. And yet the letter did not invite fear. It invited patience. After the disclosure, something changed permanently. Reagan's public appearances became rare, then non-existent. Interviews stopped. Photographs ceased. The man who once communicated effortlessly with millions now lived beyond their reach. There were no updates, no progress reports, no attempts to maintain relevance. Silence became the defining feature of his later life. This silence was not abandonment. It was protection. Alzheimer's does not simply erase memory. It alters relationships, reshapes identity, and redefines time. Days lose continuity. Faces lose context. The present becomes unmoored from the past. For someone whose life had been constructed through narrative, through the telling and retelling of stories, this was not merely decline. It was dismantling. Those caring for Reagan adapted continually. Routines were repeated. Language was simplified. Decisions once made instinctively now required guidance. Independence narrowed. The man who had once commanded rooms now relied on others to orient him within his own. And yet the tragedy was not defined solely by what was lost. It was defined by what remained. Moments of recognition still occurred. Familiar voices brought comfort. Simple pleasures, sunlight, routine, presence took on greater meaning. Life became smaller, but not empty. What vanished was not humanity, but complexity. For the world watching from a distance, this period was uncomfortable. There was no spectacle to observe, no dramatic arc to follow. The absence itself became the story. A figure once omnipresent had receded entirely, leaving behind only recordings and recollections. This created a strange dissonance. Public memory preserved Reagan exactly as he had been, articulate, confident, and in control. Private reality told a different story, one that could not be broadcast without violating dignity. And so the two versions existed side by side, the remembered Reagan and the living one. They never met. The emotional weight of this divide is difficult to overstate. To be remembered for who you were while slowly losing access to that identity is a uniquely modern tragedy. Fame ensures that memory survives long after the self no longer can. For Reagan, the world continued to replay speeches, images, and moments from his peak years. The applause echoed through history, but it echoed without him. What made this phase especially painful was its length. Alzheimer's does not rush. It stretches time, prolonging uncertainty for families and caregivers. Progress is measured not in milestones, but in adjustments. Each small change becomes a reminder of what has already slipped away. There was no dramatic end to Reagan's public story, only a gradual disappearance. He did not fall from grace. He faded from view. And in that fading lies the heart of the tragedy. A life spent mastering communication ended in a condition that eroded language. A career built on memory and narrative concluded with forgetting. A man defined by presence finished his days in quiet absence. This is not irony meant for judgment. It is reality meant for reflection. Because Alzheimer's does not discriminate between the powerful and the ordinary. It reduces every life to the same fundamental question: what remains when the structures we rely on begin to fall away? For Reagan, what remained was care, routine, and the steady presence of those who stayed. There were no grand statements left to make, no legacy to defend, only the day in front of him unfolding slowly. And that raises a difficult thought, one that does not belong only to this story. If recognition cannot protect us from disappearance and achievement cannot shield us from decline, then what truly defines a life at its end? That question lingered quietly through Reagan's final years, unanswered, waiting for a moment when the world would finally be ready to listen, not to his voice, but to his silence. There are moments in a life that divide everything into before and after. For Ronald Reagan, that moment was not a medical crisis witnessed by cameras, nor a dramatic withdrawal from public view. It was quieter and far more decisive. It arrived in the form of a letter. When Reagan publicly acknowledged his Alzheimer's diagnosis, the decision did more than inform the nation. It closed a door that would never reopen. From that point forward, there would be no gradual return, no redefinition of public role, no final appearance to reassure those who hoped the decline might be overstated. The announcement was not an update. It was a farewell. What made this moment irreversible was not the diagnosis itself, but the clarity with which Reagan and his family understood what lay ahead. Alzheimer's offered no redemption arc. There would be no recovery to prepare for, no strength to reclaim, only adaptation, patience, and loss measured in small, daily increments. After the letter, life contracted decisively. Public schedules disappeared. Invitations went unanswered. The mechanisms that once extended Reagan's presence into the world were dismantled by choice. This was not retreat out of shame or fear. It was a recognition that dignity required distance. To remain visible while losing command of memory and language would have meant surrendering control of the very identity Reagan had spent a lifetime constructing. From this point on, everything became private. Care replaced ambition. Routine replaced achievement. The questions that once filled Reagan's days, how to persuade, how to lead, how to shape outcomes, were replaced by simpler, more fragile concerns. Was the day familiar? Was the face across the room reassuring? Was the moment calm? Those closest to him understood the finality of this shift. Alzheimer's does not allow for temporary pauses. Once independence begins to narrow, it does not widen again. The person you have been does not vanish all at once, but it does not return either. For Reagan, the man who had always prepared meticulously for transitions, this was the only transition he could not manage. There were no speeches to rehearse, no roles to study, no audience to steady with humor or conviction. The illness required surrender rather than performance. And so the world was left behind. This point of no return also redefined legacy. From here on, Reagan's reputation would no longer be shaped by action, but by memory, other people's memory. He would not correct interpretations, challenge narratives, or refine how history spoke his name. His story would move forward without his participation. That loss of agency is rarely discussed, yet it may be the most profound consequence of cognitive decline. To live while one story continues, but without the ability to guide it, is a form of disappearance that precedes death. For the public, time moved on quickly. News cycles shifted. New figures emerged. Reagan's absence slowly became normal. His name returned only in retrospectives, anniversaries, and archival footage, always fixed in the past, never connected to the present. But for Reagan himself, time did not move forward in the same way. Days no longer formed a clear sequence. The future lost definition. What remained was the immediate moment, repeated and reshaped each day. Life did not end, but it changed in a way that could not be reversed. This was the true point of no return, not the diagnosis, not the withdrawal, but the moment when a life defined by narrative, memory, and voice crossed into a reality where none of those could be relied upon. And it forces a difficult reflection, one that extends far beyond this story. If we spend our lives building meaning through achievements and recognition, what prepares us for the moment when meaning must exist without them? After the point of no return, Ronald Reagan's life entered a phase defined not by events, but by rhythm. Days no longer unfolded according to schedules filled with destinations and decisions. Instead, they followed a quieter pattern: meals at familiar times, walks in familiar spaces, faces chosen for their constancy rather than their significance. The world he once navigated with ease had become too large, too fast, too unpredictable. So it was gently reduced. Home became the center of everything. Rooms were arranged to minimize confusion. Objects were kept in the same places. The environment itself became a form of care, designed to soften the edges of a reality that no longer held together on its own. In this smaller world, change was the enemy. Stability was the goal. Those around Reagan adjusted their expectations accordingly. Conversations were shorter. Questions were simpler. Corrections were avoided. There was no value in reminding him of what he could no longer access. The purpose was not to restore memory, but to preserve comfort. This is one of the quiet truths of Alzheimer's. Love becomes practical before it becomes emotional. It is expressed through patience, repetition, and restraint, through choosing calm over accuracy, through accepting that presence matters more than explanation. For Reagan, moments of clarity still surfaced. Familiar voices sometimes triggered recognition. Old habits lingered. Gestures, expressions, fragments of the person he had been. But these moments could not be summoned on demand. They arrived unexpectedly and faded just as quickly. To outsiders, the absence of public updates created an illusion of emptiness. In reality, life continued, just without witnesses. The days were full, but not of spectacle. They were filled with care. This phase of Reagan's life was marked by profound asymmetry. The world remembered him vividly, while he increasingly lived without access to that memory. Speeches were replayed, images circulated. His name remained intact in public consciousness, even as his personal sense of self grew less anchored. That contrast is difficult to reconcile. Legacy, by definition, exists beyond the individual. But Alzheimer's forces a cruel acceleration of that separation. The person becomes legacy before life has ended. For Reagan's family, this required a recalibration of grief. Loss did not arrive all at once. It arrived in increments, in abilities quietly surrendered, in conversations that no longer connected, in shared memories that became one-sided. Each small change required acceptance. Each day demanded adjustment. There were no dramatic scenes, No final conversations filled with closure or confession. Alzheimer's does not offer resolution, it offers endurance. As years passed, Reagan required increasing assistance. Independence narrowed further. Decisions were made for him. The responsibility of care deepened. This was not a public burden, but a private one, borne without commentary or expectation of recognition. In many ways, this period revealed a different measure of a life's value. Without achievements to reference or influence to wield, worth was no longer tied to contribution or impact. It was tied simply to being. Reagan did not need to lead. He did not need to persuade. He did not need to be remembered in the moment. His existence, reduced to its essentials, asked only one thing of those around him: to stay. And they did. This endurance, quiet, repetitive, unseen, is rarely celebrated. It does not align with cultural narratives of success or heroism. Yet it is where many lives ultimately arrive. The later years strip away the illusion that significance is proven through action alone. In this stage, Reagan's life became less about what he had done and more about how he was treated, less about history and more about humanity. The silence that once symbolized retreat now symbolized something else: acceptance, not defeat, but recognition of limits. The recognition that some chapters are not meant to be dramatic. They are meant to be gentle. And as the years moved forward, slowly and unevenly, the question that had followed Reagan since the beginning of his decline grew heavier, not because it demanded an answer, but because it no longer could be answered by him. When memory fades, what remains of a person's legacy? In Reagan's final years, the answer did not lie in speeches or decisions. It lay in the simple, enduring presence of care, in the willingness of others to remain when recognition could no longer be returned. And perhaps that is the most honest measure of what truly lasts. Ronald Reagan passed away in early June of 2004 at the age of 93. The official cause was pneumonia, but the longer story had already been written in quieter chapters, nearly a decade shaped by Alzheimer's, by gradual withdrawal, and by a life reduced to its most essential elements. When the news reached the public, it arrived with ceremony. Flags were lowered, speeches were replayed. Images from earlier decades filled screens once more. The world remembered Ronald Reagan as it had always known him, confident, articulate, and firmly in control of his narrative. But the man himself had already been gone from that version of the story for many years. There is something deeply human in this distance between remembrance and reality. We preserve people at their strongest, their clearest, their most complete. Yet life rarely ends at its peak. It ends slowly, unevenly, often without witnesses. Reagan's final years remind us that legacy is not something we carry alone. It is something others carry for us when we no longer can. Memory, in the end, becomes communal. Identity becomes shared. For a man whose life revolved around voice, persuasion, and presence, the final chapter offered none of those. Instead, it offered stillness, dependence, and the quiet truth that love is not proven by recognition, but by endurance. There were no final speeches to summarize the meaning of his life, no closing words to define his legacy, only the steady continuation of care, day after day, when applause no longer mattered. And perhaps that is where the story truly ends, not with judgment or conclusion, but with a question left deliberately open for the rest of us. When memory fades, what remains of a life, and who remains beside it? That question does not belong only to Ronald Reagan. It belongs to everyone who will one day step out of the light and hope that something, someone, will still be there.